I'll start off by clarifying that we're focusing on inclusion rather than diversity, making sure that the differences among us lead to more effective and innovative organizations, and that diversity transcends gender, ethnicity, and includes all the dimensions that make us unique, be it generation, culture, education, experience, sexual orientation and identity, physical ability, or military service. So, I'll start off with a very cool question, which is one that I often ask of many of my client groups. Diversity programs are most successful when the mandate comes from the top. How do you communicate that message through your teams, especially those involved in recruiting and selection of new hires? Jami, do you want to start us off with that one?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I guess I would say I think there are two issues. One is the talk and one is the walk. So I think that the tone does begin at the top, leadership does begin at the top, and I think you have to very clearly, very actively, very consistently communicate to people what your expectations and what your goals are. I also think lawyers like data and they like to understand the reason for doing things, so you have to give them reasons. It's not just enough to say that this is a good thing to do. It's not just enough to say it's a business imperative. But I think people really want to understand from a personal basis why you think this is important. But the second thing is the walk. And that is, they look at your teams. They look at you and how you conduct yourselves as leaders. And I think our clients increasingly look at that too. And you can say anything you want, but if you are not inclusive in your teams, and by inclusion I do mean everybody, sort of seeking different views, seeking different inputs. I was upstairs, but I heard the question from the international lawyer, reflecting that you see a value in different experiences and different backgrounds. If you're not doing that yourself, nobody who you leads will do that. So I think there's the communication, there's what you say, but there's also what you do. And when you're leading an organization or leading any kind of team, you know, you're in a fishbowl and people are looking to see how you make those choices and decisions. So I think that communication and the living that is important, but I also think being actively present. So in our firm, for example, at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, I sit on the diversity committee, I sit on the recruiting committee, I sit on the talent and training development committee. I participate, I sit on the associate compensation committee, I chair the partner compensation committee. So if I'm very present in all of the conversations where we're talking about inclusion issues, I have the opportunity to show people that I think this is worth my time. So I think all of those things, sort of how you live and the examples that you demonstrate are important, but you also have to consistently talk about it and message the issue.
That's great, and some very good points there. Ray?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Jami just said. I think communication is key. I think, you know, as I lead the National Diversity Committee for DLA, we have a steering committee, and that includes our co-managing partners, some of our practice group leaders, and it's a diverse group. I mean, I will say this, you can't have diversity without white males, right? I mean, they have to be part of the inclusion conversation, so it's important you have leaders who are leading your practice groups as well on this steering committee. I will say that one of the things that is important in the communication piece, Jami, is to make sure that we're not using qualifiers or adjectives when we're going out and hiring diverse individuals. You know, it always makes me grate a little bit when I hear we want to hear qualified, diverse lawyers. Well, qualified, what does that mean? I need someone to explain that. Exactly. That's exactly how I feel. Like it's rage. I have this power. I feel like Iron Man. So qualified, like what does that mean? What are you talking about, qualified? I mean, that's a given. We're not hiring lawyers that aren't qualified, and you never hear, you know, that phrase, at least I have never heard it, in front of a white male. You know, that we need a qualified associate working on this matter. So I just think we need to have communications about the words that we're using when we're defining the people that we want to select.
That's great, thank you, Ray. Ian?
So, VA systems, see, I get the same effect there. Diversity and inclusion has been a strategic initiative at the company for the last 4 or 5 years. And, globally, and a lot of people may not know BA Systems by brand. We're a global government contractor, defense contractor, and we have operations all over the world. And so from an inclusion standpoint, we live this every day because we have operations in many, many countries around the world. And the cultural differences, the language differences are things that we have to deal with just as part of our daily operations. But here in the U.S., for the businesses headquartered in the U.S., we actually took it a step further to a couple of years ago, being a government contractor, we have an engineering culture. So I'm a lawyer, but I'm a lawyer inside a much larger enterprise where the legal function is actually a minority. And in an engineering culture, the basic premise is what gets measured gets managed. And so the question was, okay, well, how do we, with all the engineers get in the room, how do we measure this as part of the strategic initiative? And effectively, we have two principal metrics that we focus on. One of the requirements of being a government contractor in the United States is that you're required to track your affirmative action targets, essentially set by the government, and your performance against those targets. And the net result of that, we realized, was we actually have a lot of data about the company and all of its operations around the United States and how, as a whole, we're doing against the talent pool that we're drawing from. And here again, I'm talking about all aspects of the corporation. But that data gave us information that we could then use to say, okay, to the extent that we want to do certain things to advance the diversity and inclusion objectives, we actually have information that we can get feedback from. And so it's not just a qualitative thing, we can actually have a quantitative aspect. The other part of it is we launched what we call a diversity and inclusion maturity matrix, which, on the one end of the spectrum starts with, do you comply with all of the laws and regulations that you're required to comply with? And at the other end of the spectrum ends with, do you have the cultural adaptation of D&I where you don't even have to talk about it anymore, it's just so embedded in the people and the operations that it's like air, and it just becomes part of who you are. And so in that spectrum, where are you? And we actually measure ourselves. It's a little bit subjective, but it's at least a scorecard that we can use, and because in the engineering culture, they have to be able to measure these things. So those are some of the tools that we've used, and the byproduct of that, of course, is that this is the message from on high, from management, saying these are the things that we want to strive for, these are the things that are important, and we're actually going to look for information that tells us, are we progressing or not progressing? And if we're not, then, okay, what can we do about that?
Perfect, thank you. And all three of you have given some really interesting views with that, and it leads very nicely into the next question, actually, because what you're talking about is what you're currently doing internally in your organizations. How does that then translate into your employer brand? So let's talk about diversity employer brand. How do you signal to candidates that your firm, your company values and welcomes diversity?
Well, it's easier for me because if there's anybody who wonders whether Morgan Lewis is a diverse environment, the fact that their chair is a woman is a pretty compelling statistic. And that's really true. I mean, people notice that. There are a handful of us in the country. Kim Cooper-Smith is over here. She's on the next panel. She's another one. We all know each other. So it's a little bit easier for me to say Morgan Lewis is an inclusive environment, right? So that's one way that you signal it. But I think another way that you signal it is really recognizing that, when you think about a law firm, we all interact with clients all over the world, with communities all over the world, and if everybody in your organization understands the commitment of the firm to an inclusive environment, that in itself, that is your brand. But I think the problem that law firms have had is that, and the prior panels alluded to this, there's been a lot of talk about it, but the talk is not including a lot of the people who are in the categories that we're talking about. And so until you get to a point where all of those people are sitting at the table along with people who are not thought of as diverse, because I totally agree. I mean, inclusion is about everybody. This isn't something that you're doing that excludes, you know, one group and includes another. Until all of those people are part of the conversation, your brand can't be about diversity and inclusion, because then you're not living it, and people know what's authentic and what's not. So, and I think clients know that. They see when you just have somebody show up for a pitch who doesn't really have the experience. So part of the brand has to be involving everybody in the discussion and actually thinking about it yourself, not because some client wants you to bring somebody someplace, but because you want to have an inclusive organization, so you're starting internally to do all that work.
Wait.
So Jamie's hitting it well. Boom, boom, boom. So you know, DLA, our co-managing partner in the U.S. is Stacia Kelly. So
She's
you must
one
know
of
her.
us. Yeah, we know her.
So we can sit on that same pedestal, so to speak. But I do think that it's important that firms show that they care about diversity by having diverse people in positions of power. And there's no more power than the person that's managing your firm. You know, and then you go to the practice groups, and then you go to the office managing partners and the like. But I think that, you know, if you were to look at our firms, you would see that we, from top down, we have diverse people in positions that are important to us.
That's great. Ian, what do BAE
So,
systems do?
Yeah, so from an in-house perspective, really kind of two separate answers. One is the legal function, sort of what we've done, and then the broader corporation. You know, we some of the other panelists have talked about, you know, you have to be able to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so, you know, for the legal function at BAE Systems, 70% of my direct reports are women or people of color. And inside the enterprise, from our, I have, you know, legal, contracts, and other compliance professionals reporting to me. And within those groups, the senior and middle level managers, 40% of them are women, and about 20% of them are people of color, which is more than double than the rest of the enterprise. So at some level, the legal function at BAE Systems is actually, for the rest of the enterprise, we are the model for diversity and inclusion, and we've done that in large measure because I think the legal and compliance professions tend to be more diverse. The talent pool is more diverse, pulling from the law firms, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is more diverse than other parts of our manufacturing operations or engineering communities where you know, women and people of color, there is a significant need for women and people of color in the engineering communities. When you go look at the engineering schools, they tend to be very traditional, and that's a real challenge. And so from inside the company, the legal function is a model for the rest of the company to see, which certainly helps recruiting from our perspective. But the issue that we talk about within the enterprise is, what about all the other areas where diversity and inclusion is a challenge and is a struggle and is something that we have to work very hard at? And there, you know, it requires constant messaging. It requires proactive sourcing, where, you know, we will go and retain search firms who specialize in diverse candidates, where we talk about training for managers. We talk about sort of all employee activities where inclusion is part of the conversation, and that is absolutely going to be a longer journey for the enterprise than perhaps where I can sort of see and control, but help the rest of the enterprise evolve in the right direction.
And it's fantastic that you are leading the charge in terms of showcasing what a diverse community can look like within your own organization, and taking from that part there and what Ray, you and Jami have already said as well, something that's very close to what we do here at Bloomberg in all sorts of different ways is thinking about the strategies that we employ when we do go out to recruit diverse talent. So thinking about your own organizations, I know we see it every single day of what can we do that's different, what makes us stand out from our competition. What creative strategies do you employ in your organizations when it comes to recruiting diverse talent in the market?
So I'll start with this one. So there's a few things that we do at DLA that I think helps us with our recruiting. I think, you know, the first thing that we do is we have programs that people can see on our website. They can talk to the folks that they're interviewing about, and we proactively tell them about it, the different programs. One is, of course, the flex time, although Jami reminded me while we were preparing for this that some people can see that as a negative. And while I completely agree with that point, I think that we have to get beyond that and see it as a positive and try to drill down to the folks who are seeing it as a negative and letting them know that we're providing opportunities. It's just not to women. It's open to everyone. Whoever wants to get on flex time, you know, raise your hand, right? But you have to have a reason, and it should be a good one. And we shouldn't lose good candidates and or workers because they have needs that require a flex schedule. But beyond that, I think DLA has incorporated within its diversity committee a number of what I think historically has been called affinity groups that we now call resource groups. So you have the African American resource group and the Asian American resource group and, you know, the Hispanic resource group, where they meet on a monthly basis. We have what we call Telepresence, which is I guess the next generation of video conferencing. You almost feel like you're sitting right across from the person. But during that time, it's an opportunity for them to spend time networking with each other. We have a retreat that we do on a once every other year basis, diversity retreat, where we bring in all of our diverse lawyers, come together. Again, they network. Over the last year and a half since I've taken over as co-chair of the diversity committee, we've actually started thinking that, you know, there's power in numbers as opposed to separating these resource groups as much as we have in the past. We're actually having what we call every 6 weeks we have a partner diversity and partner and counsel diversity network telepresence, where you know, it doesn't matter as long as you're diverse, we come together. And then finally, I would say that you know, we have what we call law within our firm, which is the Legal Alliance for Women. And it is quite a powerful group within our firm, again, which I think brought the theory to me that if we bring all of our other diverse groups together, the power in numbers can actually be helpful in that regard. But law, actually, there's a lot of conferences, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of seminars, and we actually do every other year we do the Law GC Summit, which is basically our partners in our firm, women partners in our firm, and we invite our outside counsel, general counsels who are women, and so I'll get an email saying, hey, Ray, do you have general counsel who are women that you can invite to this conference? And I'll be like, well, can I go? And they're like, no, you can't go. This is just for women. And you know, I do. I tell them, and you know, I think that has been really successful.
And how many of these strategies that you have and the things that you've already implemented internally do you outwardly advertise when you are recruiting?
So, so outwardly, meaning that it's on our website. I think the Legal Alliance for Women, our resource groups, and you know, we have a diversity website. So if you go onto our main website, you can quickly find our diversity website, and it has some of that information in there. But what I would say is, you know, I'm reminded of, is probably a little bias on my part, and I apologize, but that ancient Chinese secret commercial that used to be out there about one of the cleaning, does anybody remember that? Am I old? Like, Calgon, take me away. That's what it was.
That's the bubble bath, right? That was the
I don't
bubble
know
bath.
what it was.
Calgon, take me away was the bubble bath,
Yes.
yeah.
So there are some secrets we like to keep to ourselves, is my point, and so we don't advertise everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Good to know.
So can I add to that on the recruiting side? Because we've been focused for a long time on, it's not so hard to recruit women anymore because everybody knows about 50% of the people who come out of law school are women. So we don't have any trouble with that. But I think all law firms struggle with recruiting attorneys of color and other, ethnically diverse attorneys. So what we've started to do is we've gone to alternative sourcing. So we go to events around the country that are specifically designed to promote attorneys of color, attorneys from different ethnicities, international attorneys, and we send some of our most senior partners to those, and we really look for people who we think maybe wouldn't come through the traditional channels. So I think if law firms are going to try to develop a different pipeline, I think you've got to look different places. We also have programs with a couple law schools where we have scholars programs where we provide scholarships to diverse students who we then partner with and work with. They work at different organizations, sometimes during the summer, and then we have an opportunity to really get to know them. I think developing the pipeline is the real problem, because the reason I made the comment to Ray on our prep call about flex time not being the answer to everything is that every scientific study lately shows that women are not leaving the profession because they don't want to work as hard. They are leaving the profession because they don't see a path. And that's why lawyers of color aren't coming into the profession. And that's why every time somebody like Ian tries to steal one of our lawyers of color or one of our women, they're successful. Because people believe that they have a better opportunity, a better path in-house. So what we need to be doing is changing the dialogue so that we're not saying to people, listen, Mary, you don't have to work as hard. It's okay. Feel free to take an alternative track. That might be something we want to offer to her or to somebody else, but that's not the way. That's not the path to keeping women in the profession and making them successful. And similarly, lawyers of color, the biggest problem is people who feel excluded from the conversation, who feel that their backgrounds or their diversity is not appreciated by others, and they then worry about, will I have a place here? So the focus, at least at Morgan Lewis, is on increasing the pipeline, recruiting in different places, and then internally focusing on business development. So historically, a lot of firms had networking groups for women, which nobody took seriously because they thought it was just women wanting to talk to each other. Well, at Morgan Lewis, we have ML Women, and it's a program that is explicitly for the benefit of all lawyers in the firm. You would get to come to our conference. Maybe you should tell
Switch
Stacia that.
firms, yeah.
Right? And so we say to our male partners and to everyone in the firm, look, this is a business advantage that we can all use. Let's leverage the talent of the women in our firm to the benefit of everybody, just like we're leveraging the talent of the men in our firm to the benefit of everybody. So I think if we want to be more successful, we have to look at why we're losing people and where the breakdown is coming. And it's coming for women up here, not here, and for lawyers of color, it's coming in the pipeline because there are barriers to entry, because that many times law firms interview or recruit at a very small sliver of the population, so we have to broaden that pipeline out.
I would say this.
Oh, good.
That's a good answer.
Actually, I agree with that. Ian, can I jump in for 1 second? I agree with that. I would add, though, that for at least, I think, lawyers of color, unconscious bias is a really big stumbling block to recruiting and to actually advancement in the workplace. I don't know how many of you saw about a year ago the Nexton, I think it was, Nexton study where I guess it was brief was written and it was sent out to about 60 partners across the U.S. Half the group got the brief, and the person was Thomas Myers, African American. Half the group got Thomas Myers, Caucasian American, and everything else was the same. And it was they call it confirmation bias, and basically what you saw was that for Thomas Myers, African American, they found more errors in the papers than they did for Thomas Myers, Caucasian American. And and I can tell you the comments and all the things. If you can find it, you should read the study. It is that type of unconscious bias where you go into it thinking that I expect the writing of this African American to be less than the white American, and that's what you find because you're looking harder, you're working harder. And so those are some of the things that we have to be able to overcome.
Totally agree.
Thank you. Ian, I know that...
So Jami actually said something that's sort of a setup to the point I was going to make, which from an in-house counsel perspective, by and large, we're very interested in the success and the efforts of Big Law to develop a diverse and inclusive culture and a diverse and inclusive pipeline. And there's really two reasons for it. Jami pointed at one. That's where we source from an in-house legal profession. We don't typically hire, and I know there's some large corporations that are exceptions to that, but most in-house counsel operations, we source from law firms or other companies which sourced from a law firm. Because at the end of the day, I mean, for me, the ideal sort of developing candidate for a job is someone who's 7-8 years out of law school, has been trained in a law firm, has demonstrated all of the skills that are sort of table stakes for any attorney, but then be able to sort of, they want to do something different. And I've been very successful, I'll be very candid, at hiring many people like me who decided I didn't want to be a partner at a law firm, I wanted to do something else. And so that's one aspect of it. However, and I'll point that to Jami, we're equally as interested in Big Law developing a diverse and inclusive culture and pipeline of very strong attorneys, because those are the people we are going to hire in the future as outside counsel. And so I don't, from my perspective, I don't necessarily care ex ante as to whether I hire them as on a per hour basis or I hire them as an employee. Either way, I want to see that talent be developed. And since I don't have the direct connection to the beginning of the pipeline, I'm relying on the intermediary of Big Law to do that for me. So I'm very interested in what they're doing for multiple reasons, and I think a lot of in-house counsel would share that view.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I know that BAE Systems has done quite a lot of work with military veterans. Do you want to make any comments on? So one area of our diversity, particularly given what we do, is in the military service area, veterans area, 13% of our employees are veterans. We hire 1,000 veterans a year. And that's probably for the last 4 or 5 years, that's been sort of the average. So 5,000 veterans we've hired in the last 5 years. One of the things that we take great pride in is our mission. And one of the themes that we talk about inside the company is we protect those who protect us. That's what we do. And it's a very powerful mission. When you talk to a Medal of Honor winner who talks about their experience in the war, and how something we did may have contributed to saving their lives, it is extraordinarily powerful and motivating to the workforce. And for the veterans who come to work with us, they bring those stories. And they can say, I was in one of these vehicles, or I was wearing one of those vests. And that's the experience as a user, the experience as a veteran, and then to bring that into the workforce, it's extraordinarily powerful. And so we obviously focus a lot of attention on trying to find, recruit, and retain. Mm-hmm. And the retain part's the challenge more than the recruit part, because they really are an extension of our customer at one level. There's an affinity to our customer, and they bring a domain knowledge that is invaluable across the enterprise and even in the legal community.
We've hired former JAG officers from all the services, and they bring knowledge about how the government looks at certain problems. They bring networking of former colleagues of theirs, so if there's a problem, they know who to call, and so we're very active. Job fairs and active recruiting and transition, particularly those who've just come back from theater. There are some special things that they and their families are looking for and need to help them sort of re-enter civilian life. And so we have a variety of programs. And one of the things, just to add on to that we do, and it's something we really don't advertise and we don't really talk about it publicly at all because that's not why we do it, is we have a very active and very successful Wounded Warrior program where we will go out and proactively try to strategically place Wounded Warriors around the company to give them the extra infrastructure and support and mentoring and whatever they need to be successful, and not with the intent of giving them a job, but rather with the intent of launching them on their next career. And that program has been very successful, and it's not something, again, we don't really talk about it a lot publicly, because that's, we're not doing it for the publicity reasons, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And certainly the other veterans who see that recognize that that's kind of who we are and how we are.
That's great, a very powerful message, thank you. Ray, you touched upon this a little bit earlier on in one of your previous answers. What steps have you taken to ensure that diverse candidates are successful in your recruiting process? You mentioned affinity groups earlier on. Do you want to give us a little bit more detail around that?
So what I would say is, and we've talked about this all day, from the top down, you have to educate. You have to educate the lawyers in your firm about things like unconscious biases, and it's important that the folks that you're recruiting, not only you're recruiting, that you're providing them with an opportunity or an understanding that you want to retain them, and then you want to advance them. And so we have, this national steering committee, and we have, unconscious bias training for the committee. Some of them get it, and some of them still, I'm like, how can't you understand this? I mean, here's an example I'd like to try for a second. And I've seen this, and maybe some other people have seen this. If you can just write down a leader, the first thought that comes to your mind of a leader, right? And someone that is leading. You guys writing it down or thinking about it, right? And typically, because he's the President of the United States, how many thought of Obama? President Obama, right? Okay, and so then the next question goes, how many of you actually thought of a woman? Yeah, so it becomes limited in terms of women. And then how many thought of an Asian person? Yeah, so one person. And so those are our biases. That's what we think. That's when we quickly see people and we think about it. So it makes it difficult for women and Asians to become leaders in firms because we don't see them as leaders for whatever reason. And I would say that probably would have been true for Obama as well. I mean, for African Americans as well, and Hispanic Americans. We just don't see them as leaders. And so until Obama, we kind of, lawyers of color, we were less likely to see.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ian, do you want to comment a little bit on how you're ensuring that your slate of candidates that are getting through the recruitment process are diverse?
So, one of the things I talked a little bit earlier about how, what gets measured gets managed. And so then the question is, so when you do have the numbers, then the question is, what do you do about it? Obviously, you can't just assign quotas. That would be wrong and illegal. But so what can you do? And so what we focus on is ensuring, particularly in the leadership positions, above a certain grade, that every slate of candidates who comes in has to be diverse. And if it's not, then you actually have to step back and say, why is it not? And in most cases, it's because the process was too narrowly defined, the requirements were too narrowly defined, and it's really about opening the aperture. And you get a much broader perspective And sometimes it is not just unconscious bias, but sometimes it's conscious bias, right? And so you gotta, so we actually have a formal structure around that to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But the corollary is we also require that the interviewer slate has also got to be diverse, so that you don't end up essentially, making it a sham, where some a token woman or token person of color comes in and sits in front of 5 older white men, right? That you have to create it, and to the extent you want to make a change, you want people to actually, if you made them a job offer, would they say yes? Showing them a diverse interview panel is part of that. So those are some of the things that we've instituted over the last couple of years, and it's one of the mechanisms that we use to try to change the numbers, albeit it may be slow because you may not have that many positions to fill, but when we do fill them, we're very careful and very conscious to make sure we're trying to do it in as open a way as possible.
Perfect, thank you. I'm conscious that I want to leave some time at the end for questions. I just have one more, and Jami, why don't you start us off with this one? What are some of the ways in which you've seen diverse hires that have come into your organizations? What are some of the ways that you've seen that they've been more successful when they've come in?
So I guess 2 things on that. First, I really want to compliment you guys on what you're doing with the military veterans. That's really impressive, and I'm very moved by your vision there, so I think that's great. I think 2 things. First of all, I think that one of the things that makes people successful is having a dialogue about their careers. And I think one negative impact of our heightened sensitivity is people feel constrained about having a conversation with someone that acknowledges their race, their gender, their preferences, whatever it is. So you have the person sitting there feeling different, and everybody's pretending that the person isn't different. And I think there are a couple different ways that that's really had blowback. When I have 4 children. I had my first child when I was a second-year associate. Nobody asked me whether or not I had full-time childcare or whether I wanted to work full-time or any of those things, and nobody changed my assignments. I came back, I got them, I was off on trial, doing whatever I was doing. Now, people are very sensitive, so they're sitting there thinking, well, X just had a child, we don't want to burden her, so we're just going to not give her those same requirements, but nobody talks to her about it. 2 years later, she's sitting there doing document review while everybody else is trying cases. Same thing with attorneys of color. We talk about wanting them to succeed, but then everybody doesn't want to offend somebody by doing something that suggests that they're getting a special program. So instead of actually finding ways to talk about how people can feel more connected, we ignore the problem. When you ignore the problem, you don't have a relationship. When you don't have a relationship, you can't succeed. That's it. So I think having the dialogue, to your point, how do we make people more successful that way? If your question is, how have we seen the impact of diversity change things, what I would say is you really just have to look around any group that you're in to know the answer to that question. People come up with ideas and thoughts and approaches based on their own backgrounds. If you have 5 people in a room have the identical background, you're going to get some variety, but not as much as if you have people who come from different industry or different socioeconomic groups. So I really believe that a more diverse population is better for the reason that Kelly Tullier said, and for the reason that Tony West said, which is you get a more creative, more comprehensive array of thought. It's not that one group is smarter or better than another, it's that more input is better. And you either believe that or you don't. If you don't believe it, you can't convince your organization you do. If you do believe it, it gets in everybody's DNA.
Perfect, that's great. Ray, Ian, anything to add to that?
I would just add, I agree with what Tony said, that your sponsors, your champions don't have to be, they don't have to look like you. I mean, my sponsor was a white, short, fat male. and I love him to death. He took me to where I am, and so, it is about diversity, even as you're looking for your sponsors and your champions.
I think this is a long journey, and it's a conversation that needs to be had regularly and continuously. Mm-hmm. And people can tell when someone's blowing smoke. It doesn't take very much to figure that out. And, it's not something that you can just sort of, bang a gavel and say, that's going to be the way it's going to be. It doesn't work that way.
Sure.
It takes conversation, it takes discussion, it takes dialogue. And I think that's the fact that we can talk about it is a good thing, because I suspect generations ago we couldn't even have this conversation. And I think as long as we have a lot of people who continue to push this forward, progress will occur over time, but it is a long journey.
It is indeed. Well, thank you very much for that. We've got 5 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask the panel.
My name is David Sarnoff. I'm a legal recruiter at my own search firm, the Sarnoff Group. And I wanted to address something Mr. Graham said about the compliance aspect of diversity recruiting. And it doesn't sound like it happens at your organization, but over my career, I've experienced situations where leadership or management of a client has made it clear they want diversity candidates submitted for these positions. And then you start dealing with the attorneys who are actually doing the interviewing, screening the resumes, and once you engage with them, you get a different message. And the ones who are actually going to be working or hiring for their specific groups. So how would you advise an organization to monitor the compliance at every step of the process? Because management gives the directive, and then the folks who are actually executing it sometimes change the message. And if I don't submit what they're telling me they want because they're doing the actual hiring, I'm caught in a difficult situation.
Well, and I think it's a multifaceted problem. When we instituted some of the metrics at BAE, we debated the opposite problem. The opposite concern was that someone would just simply, hire a person of color or hire a woman because they were a person of color, because they're a woman, and not because of the fact that they were able to do the job, which in the long run sets the whole project back, right? That's just as bad. And we're fortunate in the legal community, I think, because certainly relative to the rest of our company, we have a relatively more diverse pool to draw upon. And so, I believe as long as you open the aperture wide enough, I think you'll get plenty of candidates and plenty of very well qualified candidates. And so, but I think that from the compliance challenge, from the top through middle management, you have to make this cultural. If it's just a directive from the CEO, it will die 2 or 3 levels down. And of course, the lawyers are not going to go running around sort of, trying to, hunt them down, although sometimes that happens. But, and so, I mean, this is part of why I think it's a long journey, because you need to get people, particularly who are in the process of doing the hiring, to accept the premise. If they don't accept the premise, maybe they're the wrong manager. I mean, in the long run. And so I think that's, I mean, it is a real challenge, but it's also one of the reasons why in corporations we have different groups that are involved in the process. So you don't just get 1 or 2 people get to make these decisions. You have human resources, which tends to be more diverse as a function. You have legal. You have other people sort of watching the process. And so if somebody commits a foul, there may be people who can actually see it and then do something about it. But at the end of the day, it requires that person's manager to say, look, that's not, you're not getting it, right? This is what we're looking for. I'm not telling you to hire that person or that person, but I am telling you, you gotta open your mind. And that's I think the cultural aspect, particularly for folks who've been in the corporate world for a generation or 2. It is a change, and it's going to require them to be flexible.
Perfect. Thanks, Ian. Sadly, we are out of time, but I'm sure the panelists will be happy to answer questions during the networking sessions. Thank you all for being a part of it today. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.